containers that we loaded. Back in December, we really shut this thing off, and in large part because steamship lines had to learn how to price their product. They didn't follow down the dry bulk rates consistently enough to continue to argue for us using their service. The market basically went all back to dry bulk, so we lost the container business. Then the steamship lines, as well as bulk freight, steamship lines responded, they lowered their rates, bulk freight started to tickle back up, and we're starting to load containers again. But what I think is interesting about this in terms of a trend is what's coming out of this next cycle is just the percentage of DDGs and soybean meal that we're loading. And if I had April numbers on here, I think it'd be even more dramatic. I think you're going to see DDGs and soybean meal maintain, I call it an inelastic shipment style against freight because of this infrastructure issue I talked about. In the pack rim, that's more conducive for DDGs than it is, in terms of containers than it is for bulk. And if you drill down and just kind of look at these nations of DDG consumption and growth of that over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years, it's really a demand pull for those containers and DDGs, and I suspect this will continue into the future. If you step away and look at the broader picture here, about 7% of all the grain demand in 07 or 08 out of the United States went out in containers. It's about our maximum displacement that we achieved, I think. And this is where it went. Taiwan is really the destination leader of this business. They kind of led this transformation starting 4 or 5 years ago. And a big reason for that is Kaohsiung has a transshipment point. Steamship lines went there as a first port of call. Feed mills are located pretty close to the ports. Much of Taiwan's grain was bought from the United States anyway, and their infrastructure inside the country is pretty conducive just to switching to containers. Indonesia continues to grow in its importance in the container world out of the United States, as well as South Korea. China, it's kind of flatlined. A lot of reasons for that, but it seems to be a location that's really served well by the bulk infrastructure. It's a little harder to do business there in terms of documentation. But we start talking about where the trends of where containers need to get back to. You know, the steamship lines want to take these containers somewhere. They're going to support that through rates. Where do they want to go? They want to go where they need that box to be reloaded with a durable to bring back to North America. This is the most obvious imbalance. This is the number of containers that are coming in loaded against the number of containers leaving China that are loaded. This is where the steamship lines, obviously, they're going to want their boxes back to eventually. And then on down the line, you see a little more balance and imbalance too. I mean, Taiwan is an interesting, this is 2009 kind of predictions. We're actually exporting more loaded containers than we are importing. If you were to look at that graph a year ago, you'd see that Taiwan was importing more loaded containers than it was exporting. And that phenomenon was created by the grain shipments. We're just sending a lot of grain boxes to Taiwan, and that slowed. So that's a trend, shipment trend of the destinations. Talk a little bit about the execution challenges of the pipeline. We as shippers face, you as buyers face. We'll look at the transshipment delays, kind of contract issues with buyers, sellers, steamship line rate variability, and the capacity issues that we deal with as shippers, and kind of the documentation needs. Sorry, that doesn't show up very well. This is a timeline to talk about kind of, or graphically show transshipment. Here's this would be a container that's sitting in Chicago at a transloader that's going to be loaded with corn to go to Kaohsiung. It takes about 29 days to get it from Chicago to the customer over here. And load it in Chicago, it goes on a rail, that's the black. It goes to a port, Long Beach, sits there for a couple days, gets put on a boat, and then sails to Kaohsiung. Customer gets clearance to pull it off the Kaohsiung port and then returns it as an empty. It's a pretty efficient system. And one of the other previous presentations, I took note that I think Mark 64 days from NOLA to Taiwan. I'm sorry? 15 days, so somewhere around 50 days. That was a surprise to me, actually, because, and that probably doesn't, if you take a load of corn in Chicago and get it to Taiwan by bulk, probably tag on another 7-10 days of inland transport to get it down to the Gulf. So this container transport, not quite half, but pretty close to it, which surprised me. Here's a timeline of a transshipment box moving. I just kind of looked at a DDG box from Chicago to send to the Philippines, kind of that timeline. Again, that box is sitting in Chicago, puts on a rail line, sent to Long Beach, California. It sits there for a couple days to catch the next vessel. It sails to Hong Kong in this case, sits there for a couple of days, gets placed on a feeder vessel, sent over to Manila. And it's in the customer's hands or their ability to take it off port within 42 days with a transshipment. That's probably not too bad. But here's an example of a problem that we have, or could have, as shippers and you as receivers of transshipment delays. Here's a shipment that took 64 days. And again, there was a box sitting in Chicago, went on the rail. It got to the port fairly well of Long Beach, but it sat at Long Beach for, I don't know what that is, 10 days. Probably what happened there was it didn't get on the boat that it was intended to get on. Maybe it was a split shipment, got rolled to the next vessel. It wasn't a Maersk example, Andy. Got on the boat, sailed to Kaohsiung, and it sat there. Look at all this time it sat in Kaohsiung. It's bound for Vietnam. What happened? Well, any number of things. Maybe it's going to Haiphong and the port was congested. Maybe the steamship line wasn't eager to get a box back to Vietnam right then and there. Maybe the feeder vessel capacity from Kaohsiung to Haiphong or Ho Chi Minh City was full, and it just took a long time for that to get allocated a spot on that vessel. So it got allocated, got sent there, small transit time on the water, customer got it, and clearly very eager to get it and get it back to the port. But the soybeans, and when it got there, the customer noticed some COFO, some odor. We have examples of this going to Manila with wheat, where we had some sprouting or infestation. I'd call this the exception to the rule, for sure. The majority of our shipments go very well, but this is one of the areas that we need our steamship line partners to pay attention to if we want to build our destination marketplace and describe the attributes of container shipment. One of them we talk about is just-in-time inventory and predictable logistics. We need our steamship line partners to pay attention to this as best they can. So, other execution challenges from the perspective of a seller, and when we're dealing with our buyers. If we're talking about LC terms, if LCs get open late, or they get open with terms that are not consistent with the contract, they require amendments, or they get open with a significant amount of documentation needs that we can't comply with, the results of that are we're going to have a smaller shipment window to the contract terms. We're going to require a lot more manpower. We're probably going to have more discrepant documents. It just puts more of a challenge in the efficiency and execution of the pipeline. And that matters for a lot of obvious reasons, but one of them I'd say to you as buyers is we're dealing with a capacity restricted environment. When a seller gets a container, there's generally more buyers for that container or the product in that container than there are containers available to saturate it. If you make yourself easy to deal with and make your documentations as easy as possible to deal with, those suppliers are going to come back to you and keep coming back to you, and you're going to buy it probably cheaper at a fair price, and you're going to get some of that consistent supply. Okay, some other things that a shipper faces in the U.S.